Welcome back to my Ask a Knitter series, where I answer common questions that I get asked by knitters. In today's lesson, we're going to take a look at unusual construction styles, and the one I'm going to be looking at in particular is side-to-side construction, and the kind of difficulties you'll encounter and why you'd want to use it and how you can possibly modify it a little, plus some examples of different patterns that I've done that use that side-to-side construction technique. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss any of the videos in the series or any ones that are upcoming, make sure you subscribe. But for now, let's hop into today's video. Well, let's take a look at some side-to-side construction techniques. I'm going to first of all, just because I'm going to forget the names, I'm going to tell you the names of the patterns that I've got. This one here is ribosome, where the yoke is side to side with a two-color cable being worked and then the body is worked down. This one here is capitoline, C-A-P-I-T, let me double check. C-A-P-I-T-O-L-I-N-E, so capital ein. And then, let me pull this up here. This is one of my favorites. This is the adult version of Ravi, but there's also a child's version. And it is probably one of my all-time favorite garment constructions, and in fact a lot of the others were kind of based on this to a certain extent. So when you're doing side to side, you run into a couple of potential problems because everything's turned on its head. Normally, for the depth of things, you're worried about row gauge, and how far down it goes is going to determine how deep it is, the number of rows you work. Whereas with this, for the yoke part anyway, it's work from side to side. And what that means is that the number of rows you work will determine how wide it is, how wide the neck is, and how wide the upper yoke is. So that takes a little bit of kind of twisting things on its head to a certain extent. And particularly if you're used to paying close attention to your stitch gauge, suddenly you're kind of changed it around, and so row gauge is what becomes really important at this stage because everything is determined by row gauge. So that does take a little bit of mental gymnastics to remember what's happening. Now, the basic construction of this one and this one are the same because the top part is done first of all. So see the bottom of this kind of slip stitch lace panel, that's where the top part finishes. So it starts, I'm not sure if it's the right or the left, but you'll start on one side working across like this. And what you're doing is you're doing a series of short row wedges where there's less rows here at the neck and there's more at the bottom. And so what that means is that you're going to have the right size neck that you want because you need less rows because the neck needs to be smaller, but then you have the maximum number at the bottom of the yoke where you want it, obviously, because of the fact that when you get to a bottom of a yoke, you need every single stitch because it's your sleeves and your upper body, just less whatever you have at the underarm. This does make it kind of tricky for modifying because it means that if you're like, I want a smaller neck, and you just decide to work less rows, it could mean that the bottom of your yoke is also too small. So you've got to kind of think about the implications of changes that you make as you go through. So in this kind of a case, if you wanted a smaller or a bigger neck, what you would do is you wouldn't change the number of total rows here at all, but you might convert some of the rows that used to be full rows into short rows. For instance, if you want to make the neck a little bit smaller, if you wanted to make it a little bit bigger, you might take some of the ones that had been short rows and convert them into full rows, because then you'll have more rows happening up here. So it's all to do with the short rows, but you don't want to change the overall number of rows worked for the bottom of the yoke, because that's going to mean that you basically will not have enough stitches or enough rows to be able to fit around the lower part of the body. So that's the most important thing to remember when you're dealing with side-to-side upper yokes. With this, my preference is often for things like garter stitch because it's so easy to work over a long stretch, and it's also, you can work lots of rows into it because it's compressed out this way, and it allows you to actually build in enough short rows that you can actually make it work. Whereas with stockinette stitch, that's going to be a lot trickier. So generally, side-to-side yokes like this, you're more likely to see in garter stitch because it's just going to work a little bit better. So for this one, it's like you've just got like a big circular collar all the way around when you've reached this point, and then underneath this, stitches were picked up at the bottom of the yoke. Then the sleeves were separated, there was underarm stitches worked, and the sleeves were worked in a standard way from the top down, the body was worked from the top down, and the only other addition to this is you can see there's a short row hem, so the back of it is longer here and shorter at the front. You can see that very clearly that there's a curve going on there, and that's all tied to the fact that it's just short rows. What I'm wearing here is very similar construction. The difference being at the top here, you see I've got an integrated I-cord edge. So that's worked at the same time as you're working all of the garter stitch, because it's going to create this curl and a nice neat edge at the top. What that also does is it stops the spreading out too much. So with this one, because it was 2 rows of each color, so you're striping 2 fairly brightly contrasting colors, I didn't want to work the I-cord edging as I was going, because it would mean that I'd have stripes of those colors going through, which is not what I wanted at all. I wanted a single color. So this was worked afterwards and all the stitches were picked up. What that actually meant, because garter stitch can stretch out really far without an edging, before I put this edging on and you put it down, the garter stitch kind of splayed out at the neck edge and it looked way too big. And so the I-cord is actually what brought it all into shape and kept it a lot more cohesive. And it also means with this, if you had done that and you wanted it even smaller, what you could do is even start skipping some of the rows and pulling the I-cord in even a little bit more. So the I-cord gives you a lot of stability and a little bit of an ability to kind of control it. But because you're working from side to side here, that also allows me to do this slip stitch cables. So what that is it looks like a single, I'll turn around here as well, it looks like a single color cable going all the way around, basically almost floating over the 2 color garter stitch stripes. And the way you work that is these are always knit, whereas the other ones are in garter. So it's knit on the right side, purl on the wrong side. And when you're working the darker color, those stitches are just slipped. You never ever work the actual cable stitches with the darker color. So it just looks like you've got this stockinette stitch, light color floating across the striped garter stitch underneath. So very straightforward, very easy to work, but it has a really, really big impact on it. Now this one also is a deeper yoke. You can see it comes down to here and then more or less immediately divides out as soon as you come down. So it's a little bit deeper by virtue of the fact that we're trying to keep all of those cables as a big feature on it. This one here is taking the whole thing a step further, and it is a little trickier because when you're going a step further with this, the Guggen cardigan is another version of this as well. But it means that you're casting on the entire thing. You're never picking up stitches from the bottom. The whole thing is side to side, all in garter stitch. And remember, if you've got an all over garter stitch garment, it is going to be a little bit heavier. So be aware of that you want to use a lighter yarn or perhaps a woolen spun yarn if you're not using a light yarn, so that it's not going to have the same density. You've got the I-cord neck again here with short rows up across the top. So you'll work, this one has a little bit of a lace pattern going down here. You could work it all the way up to the top, but then you'd kind of be running into problems with your short rows up here if you wanted to start those straight away. So you work all the way across here with this part just being straight out and this part having the short row wedges the same way as I was showing you with Ravi. When you reach here, you're going to separate it out. So you'll cast on stitches for the underarm, join them with the upper yoke, and let me turn it around here, and then you're just going to work the sleeve from side to side with the yoke and the sleeve together. So you're still doing those short rows the same way as you had. The bottom part with this, I actually had a provisional cast on and then I grafted it together, but you can absolutely just do a 3-needle bind off, will work very well also. And across here afterwards, I just worked this straight section, and you can probably see that there's even a little short row wedge worked in here where there's a bit of lace work from side to side, where it's narrow up here and wider down there. So that gives an A-line shaping to the body. When you're finished with here, you're going to, those stitches will go aside and it'll form the sleeve. And then you join everything back up again here, where you'll have your yoke and the body will join up. You work all the way across the back here in garter stitch, everything being plain here, and then just your short rows up here. And then you're going to do exactly the same thing across the other side here. So it's very modular, as in, you know, each section does make logical sense, but you can see how this type of construction is quite tricky to modify. So like I've explained, particularly for something like this where the yoke is done separately, how you can change the size of the yoke relative to the lower part of the bust. With something like this, it's going to get even trickier because you're also trying to pull in sleeves being knit from side to side at the same time as the upper arm and the body. So the two places that I've shown you here is probably the easiest way to modify. So if you want to make the body smaller or bigger, short rows are going to be how you do it. So in this case, I've done the A-line short row, but you could also do a little bit of bust shaping from side to side as well. With the sleeve, there's a few short rows, if I remember, there's a few short rows worked so that the cuff is smaller and this is bigger, but you can add on more of those. You could also work a straighter or a shorter section at the bottom here if you wanted to make it bigger, or you wanted to make it smaller. But there's so many different interplays between the different parts of the body here that if you do want to make a change, you want to draw it out, figure out where else that's going to impact, and if you can live with it, or if there's a way you can minimize the impact to that other part of the body. I hope you enjoyed today's video in the Ask a Knitter series. If you're enjoying the videos, make sure you subscribe so you can follow along with each new one that we're releasing in the series and you're not going to miss any. We're going to have some more in terms of garment construction coming up, so make sure you keep watching to not miss any of the ones in the series. And thank you for watching today.